Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we breathe life back into the stone and steel of the past and stand eye to eye with those who dared to shape the world in ways that still echo today. I am your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we scale iron beams and brave dizzying heights to stand beside a man whose name soars above the skyline of Paris and into the imagination of the entire world. Tonight, we meet the restless spirit behind the iron lattice, the master builder of wind and steel, the man who gave us an icon that almost never rose at all. His name? Gustave Eiffel. Sit back, pour yourself something warm, and look up, way up, as we step into the life of the man who raised Paris into the clouds. To understand Gustave Eiffel, we must first walk the narrow streets of Dijon in the early 19th century, a city of vineyards and stone houses, of merchants and makers, where the hum of trade mixed with the slow, patient rhythms of provincial life. Born Alexandre Gustave Bonnickhausen dit Eiffel on December 15, 1832, he arrived in a France that was mending itself after revolution, empire, and restoration. He was not born to aristocracy or to the salons of Parisian elites. Instead, he came into a world of practical people, whose wealth lay in hard work and patient craft. Gustave's family was of German descent. His great-grandfather had come from the Rhineland, and the family name, Bonnickhausen, spoke of those deep roots. But it was Gustave's father who chose to drop the old name, adopting Eiffel after the Eiffel Mountains of his ancestors' homeland, a new name for a family determined to belong fully to France. Gustave's father, Francois Alexander, was a former army officer, a man shaped by discipline, but who soon found himself less suited to business. The Eiffel family's small vinegar and chemical works in Dijon, however, was kept alive and thriving not by the father, but by the mother, Catherine Mélanie. It was she, shrewd, capable, determined, who ran the books, oversaw production, managed suppliers, and negotiated with traders. And in this world of barrels, bottles, and bustling courtyards, young Gustave learned the first quiet lessons of enterprise, that an idea means nothing without a plan, that success depends on the small, steady details few notice but all rely on. As a boy, Gustave was bright, though not an obvious prodigy. He preferred the gentle certainty of facts over abstract chatter. In school, he gravitated toward the new sciences that were reshaping France: chemistry, physics, metallurgy. Yet, young Eiffel was no pampered student, cloistered away in city classrooms. His early days were often spent near the warehouses and the train yards where raw goods came and went. He watched iron wagons rattle along freshly laid tracks, the pulse of a new industrial age humming in his bones. His mother, seeing the spark in her son, made sure he could feed it. She pushed him to complete his schooling at the Collège Sainte-Barbe in Paris, a gateway to the grander ambitions of French engineering. In 1852, after struggling through the rigid entrance exams, he won a place at the École Centrale des Arts et Manufactures. There, the boy from Dijon learned to calculate load stress, to test materials, to translate abstract equations into iron beams that would one day carry trains and people across valleys and rivers. He was no idle dreamer. Eiffel was methodical, stubborn, and quietly ambitious. He did not crave fame, he craved mastery. Where others saw cold iron, he saw lines of force and beauty. Where others hesitated, he asked, how can we make it lighter, stronger, bigger? The roots of a builder. And yet, beneath the sketches and calculations lay something deeper, a practical memory of his mother's business sense, that good work must meet real needs, that every rivet and beam must justify itself, that a builder's job is never done until the structure stands proud against wind, rain, and time itself. When he left the École Centrale in 1855, the world outside the classroom was ready. The railways were hungry for young engineers. Bridges were needed. Viaducts, iron frameworks that could defy rivers and gorges. And Gustave Eiffel, the boy from Dijon who watched barrels roll through his mother's yard, who learned to trust steel and wind more than applause, was ready too. So remember this: before the tower, before the bridges that dance over valleys and rivers, before the scandal and the triumph, there was only a boy born in Dijon, a mother who would not quit. And a quiet young man who looked at iron and saw something no one else yet dared to build. From mustard fields to iron beams, the journey of Gustave Eiffel had only just begun. When Gustave Eiffel stepped out of the École Centrale in 1855, the world he found was one of smoke, steam, and restless ambition. France was transforming itself at a pace that would make ancient kingdoms dizzy. A new empire of iron rails and roaring engines, factories that belched progress into the sky, cities swelling with people on the move. Eiffel was just 23, a thin, watchful young man with a neat beard and an unshakable calm that would become his trademark. He might have joined any comfortable government bureau, many of his classmates did, earning steady wages and writing safe reports. But Gustave was made of more restless iron. He wanted to build things that would stand, things that would move, things that would prove the power of modern engineering. His first real break came under the wing of Charles Nepveux, an experienced engineer who specialized in railway equipment and metal bridges. Nepveux saw the young Eiffel's sharp mind and gave him problems that no textbook could solve. Bridges that had to be built quickly, metal structures that needed to span longer distances than ever before. In those days, building in iron was still part art, part guesswork. There were rules, yes, but pushing those rules safely was a daring act. Iron was lighter than stone, more flexible, but also deceptive. Get it wrong and your bridge would twist, buckle, or collapse under the weight of a single train. Eiffel proved he could get it right, and better yet, he could innovate. When Nepveu's business hit financial trouble, Eiffel didn't fold his hands and walk away. He took over the contracts himself, shoulder to shoulder with the workers in the foundries, hammering out solutions where others saw risk. In 1866, Gustave Eiffel founded his own company, the Eiffel at Sea, and from that point, iron became not just his trade, but his language. He was not yet the famous figure who would look down on Paris from the top of a tower, but already his name was spreading along the railways and rivers of France. He took bold commissions. One of his first great triumphs was the railway bridge over the Garonne River at Bordeaux, a daring structure that used compressed air caissons to sink its foundations deep beneath the riverbed, a risky method few dared attempt. When others doubted it could be done safely, Eiffel simply calculated every inch, triple-checked the design, and made it stand. The bridge opened in 1860, a gleaming spine of iron connecting the right and left banks of Bordeaux. It was not just a bridge, it was a promise that Eiffel could build what others only dreamed of. Then came the viaducts, light, elegant frameworks that seemed to float above the landscape rather than crush it beneath massive stone. Nowhere is Eiffel's genius clearer than in the Garabit Viaduct, completed in 1884. Stretching 565 meters over the deep Truyère River gorge in southern France, the Garabit Viaduct was, at the time, the highest bridge in the world. Its central arch soared 400 feet above the river, an audacious lacework of iron painted bright red to stand defiantly against the green hills. It did not just stand, it danced. Eiffel understood the wind. He knew how to use trusses and open frameworks to let air pass through rather than batter the structure. Where others saw brute force, he saw balance, lightness, and grace. Passengers crossing the Garabit Viaduct looked down through a skeleton of iron so daring that even seasoned railwaymen caught their breath. But the trains never slowed. Eiffel's calculations held true. Gustave Eiffel's work soon crossed borders and oceans. In Portugal, he built the Maria Pia Bridge in Porto, another breathtaking arch spanning the Douro River. So advanced was its design that when the bridge opened in 1877, people came from across Europe just to see how a single slender iron rib could hold so much weight, yet look so impossibly delicate. Across the Atlantic, Eiffel's ironwork even made its way into the skeleton of another icon, the Statue of Liberty. When the great sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi needed someone to design the internal frame that would hold liberty, enlightening the world aloft in New York Harbor, he turned to Eiffel. It was Eiffel's system of iron ribs and flexible supports that allowed Liberty's copper skin to stand firm, yet yield to the wind. The same principles he'd tested on bridges and viaducts, now crowned by a torch above the Atlantic waves. A man who knew the cost of iron. But Gustave Eiffel's genius was not just in metal, it was in people. He understood that no design mattered if his workers could not build it safely. He insisted on higher standards, better working conditions, and precise planning that reduced the need for dangerous improvisation on site. When he won the contract for the Exposition Universelle's Grand Tower, the project that would become his immortal signature, he did so because people trusted that Eiffel's structures did not fail. He had earned that trust, not with showmanship, but with rivets, blueprints, and a mind that never settled for good enough when perfect was still possible. So the boy from Dijon, patient, quiet, stubborn, forged more than bridges. He forged a reputation that could span chasms as wide as the rivers he crossed. His towers and arches rose not just on iron beams, but on a foundation of discipline, innovation, and an unwavering belief that no span was too wide if you had the courage and the calculations to cross it. The iron was only the beginning. By the late 1880s, Gustave Eiffel had spanned rivers, stitched nations together with bridges, and raised iron arches that seemed to float on air. But even for him, France's master of iron, there was still a question. What could you build when you didn't have to cross a river, carry a train, or support a road? What could you build simply to reach the sky? The dream takes shape. The spark came not from Eiffel alone, but from two of his most trusted engineers, Maurice Coquelin and Émile Nouguier. One evening in 1884, in the hush of Eiffel's bustling office, the two men sketched an impossible shape, a tower of open lattice iron beams, four giant legs rooted in the earth, tapering into a single spire that would pierce the clouds. It would rise 300 meters, 984 feet, taller than anything humans had ever dared to build. Not a cathedral of stone, not a fortress, not a palace for kings, but a tower for no other purpose than to show what iron and human ingenuity could do. At first, Eiffel was cautious. He saw the sketch, nodded, and filed it away, a bold dream, but a costly one, with no obvious use except to stun the world. But a few years later, when Paris announced its grand plan to host the 1889 Exposition Universelle, a world's fair to mark 100 years since the French Revolution, that sketch reemerged like a ghost, demanding to be built. The battle began. In 1886, a design competition was announced. What monument shall mark the entrance to the fairgrounds on the Champ de Mars? Hundreds of proposals flooded in, towers, triumphal arches, ornate pavilions. Eiffel and his team submitted their audacious tower of iron. It was unlike anything the judges had ever seen, not decorative, not classical, but raw, exposed steel, an open skeleton that would dwarf the great spires of Europe's cathedrals. Some on the jury loved it, others scoffed. Eiffel, ever the strategist, knew the tower needed more than beauty. It needed purpose. So he argued that this was no mere monument, it would be a triumph of science, a symbol of French engineering at its peak, a platform for weather studies, astronomy, even military communication. It would stand not just as a marvel, but as proof that France could lead the coming industrial century. Even with approval, the tower faced a fiercer enemy than engineering challenges, the Parisians themselves. The critics came with poisoned pens. The city's leading artists, poets, and intellectuals, including the likes of Guy de Maupassant and Charles Gounod, published furious open letters denouncing the monstrous iron skeleton that would loom over the elegant boulevards and graceful domes of Paris. They called it a disgrace, a humiliation, a factory chimney towering above the Gothic spires of Notre Dame and the noble arc of the Arc de Triomphe. Ugly, they said, soulless. The hateful column of bolted sheet metal, they sneered, would scar the beauty of the City of Light forever. But Gustave Eiffel, stoic and methodical, refused to yield. He fought back in newspapers, pamphlets, and town meetings. He reminded them that Paris had once embraced radical art and architecture before. The Gothic cathedrals had been mocked too in their day. The iron skeleton, he argued, was the very soul of modernity, an expression of the age's daring spirit. He put his own fortune on the line. When the government balked at the tower's final cost, nearly 7 million francs, Eiffel signed a contract to cover most of the funding himself. In exchange, he would own the tower's operating rights for 20 years. It was a gamble that could ruin him if the crowds failed to come. Iron Rising. On January 28, 1887, despite protests, legal battles, and rumors of sabotage, the first spade of earth was turned on the Champ de Mars. The iron monster was about to rise. Construction moved with breathtaking speed, a testament to Eiffel's genius for logistics and safety. The tower's 18,038 iron pieces were prefabricated at his factory, numbered with military precision, then delivered to the site to be assembled like a giant three-dimensional puzzle. He demanded perfection from his workers, Rivets were hammered in by hand, heated in portable forges, and driven home by teams working in coordinated pairs, one to hold the red-hot rivet with tongues, another to hammer it into place with a practiced swing. Up to 300 workers perched on narrow beams hundreds of feet in the air. No harnesses, no safety nets like we'd expect today. And yet, thanks to Eiffel's meticulous planning and rigid standards, not a single life was lost to a fall. A miracle in an age when bridge and tower building often left behind a trail of graves. The moment of triumph. On March 31st, 1889, the final rivet was driven home. Gustave Eiffel himself climbed the 1,710 steps to the top, refusing the elevators that had been installed for visitors. At 984 feet, he raised the French tricolor flag against the wind and gazed out over Paris. The city that had cursed him now lay beneath his feet. When the exposition opened, the crowds came, millions of them. They stood in lines that coiled around the base, eager to ascend into the sky on an iron stairway that made the impossible feel touchable. In the decades that followed, the same critics who once called for its demolition fell silent, as the Eiffel Tower became the symbol of the very beauty it had once threatened to ruin, an emblem not of ruination, but of France's unshakable modern soul. So when you stand beneath those iron legs, when you see the lattice of riveted beams against a twilight sky, remember, the tower was almost never built. It was ridiculed, fought over, nearly abandoned. But one man, armed with iron, mathematics, and a quiet, stubborn faith, refused to bow to the critics. And because of that, Paris grew a crown of iron. And Gustave Eiffel's name became forever etched into the skyline of human imagination. His voice reminding us that iron and ambition come at a cost. For all its glory, iron can weigh heavy on a man's shoulders. And for Gustave Eiffel, the triumph that lifted Paris into the sky would soon be shadowed by scandal and betrayal, not from his tower, but from a canal thousands of miles away. After the Eiffel Tower's stunning success at the 1889 Exposition Universelle, Eiffel stood at the absolute peak of his fame. He was no longer just an engineer, he was a national hero. The iron magician who had dared what no one else would. But ambition has a way of breeding fresh appetites. For Eiffel, the next frontier was not upward, but outward, toward the tropics, toward Panama. The idea was dazzling, a canal cut through the dense jungles of Central America, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It would shrink the world, turn weeks of dangerous sea travel around Cape Horn into a matter of days. And the man behind this dream? Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French diplomat who had already orchestrated the construction of the Suez Canal. De Lesseps needed an engineer to design and build the massive iron locks that would lift ships over Panama's rugged terrain. Who better than the man who made iron defy gravity above Paris? So Gustave Eiffel signed on, confident that his iron bridges and precise methods would tame even the jungle's chaos. But the Panama project was not Suez. It was a storm of corruption, tropical diseases, ruthless terrain, and reckless ambition. Unlike Egypt's flat sands, Panama was a nightmare of mountains, rainfall, and mudslides. Money poured in from ordinary French citizens, small investors who de Lesseps and Eiffel's names. But the company's leadership was riddled with greed and incompetence. Bribes were paid, progress reports were faked, funds disappeared into the pockets of politicians and speculators. Eiffel, ever the engineer, stuck to his contracts. He delivered designs for the locks, oversaw parts of the work with his usual meticulous care. But the project as a whole was doomed from the start. It was underfunded, overpromised, and fatally flawed in its basic plan to build a sea-level canal rather than the more realistic lock system Eiffel proposed. In 1889, the very year his tower opened, the Panama Canal Company collapsed. It was the largest financial scandal of the 19th century. Over 800,000 investors lost their savings. Thousands faced ruin. The French government, desperate for someone to blame, turned its eyes on Gustave Eiffel. He was too famous not to fall. Though he had not masterminded the fraud, he had been a contractor, not a financier. His name was tied to the debacle by association. Eiffel was charged with misuse of funds, accused of accepting massive payments for locks that would never be built. The press that once praised his genius now feasted on his supposed guilt. In 1893, Gustave Eiffel stood before a judge and heard a verdict that seemed unthinkable for the man who had raised Paris into the clouds: 2 years in prison and a massive fine. He appealed, fought back with documents, testimony, and quiet defiance. The same methodical mind that had calculated the wind force on the tower now dismantled the prosecution's flimsy case. A higher court overturned his conviction in 1893, but the stain lingered. His fortune was battered, his pride even more so. It would have broken a lesser man. But Eiffel, though wounded, did what he had always done in the face of storms. He adapted. He sold much of his business empire. He stepped back from the cutthroat world of large public contracts, the realm of politicians and lobbyists that he had never trusted in his heart. Instead, he turned to pure science, a return to the quiet fascination of his boyhood. He built a laboratory inside the very tower the critics once called monstrous. There, he conducted groundbreaking research on aerodynamics, wind resistance, and meteorology, discoveries that would shape aviation and modern structural engineering for decades to come. A legacy rebuilt. In those years of retreat, Eiffel's iron mind never rusted. He published papers, mentored young scientists, and turned the Eiffel Tower from a controversial showpiece into a beacon for future technology. It became a wireless telegraph station, an early radio tower, a meteorological observatory, a lighthouse for modern science. And while Paris fumed over the Panama scandal for years, they could never quite hate the man whose iron spire still watched over them like an unwavering sentinel. His bridges never fell. His tower never wavered. But his name for a moment almost did. Yet iron can be reforged, and so could he. When scandal fades and fortune runs thin, some men vanish into the shadows of history. But Gustave Eiffel, stubborn, restless, iron-willed, did the opposite. He climbed higher, literally. After the Panama debacle nearly ruined his name, Eiffel might have retreated to a quiet villa to count his remaining francs and nurse old wounds. But the tower he had built, the monstrous iron skeleton once loathed by critics, was still there. Its spire pierced the Parisian sky, defying wind, storms, and time itself. And Gustave Eiffel, ever the engineer, looked at that iron crown and thought, why not use it? A new laboratory in the clouds. So he did something no one expected. Instead of renting out the tower's heights purely to tourists, Eiffel transformed its upper platforms into a working laboratory, the highest lab in the world at the time. At nearly 300 meters above the bustling boulevards, Eiffel and his team of assistants braved the biting winds and cold to run experiments no one else could attempt. There, unshielded from the elements, they measured air resistance, studied weather patterns, and tested the drag on different shapes and materials. He built a small wind tunnel in the tower's base and another, more advanced one at Auteuil on the outskirts of Paris. These were no idle curiosities. They were some of the first wind tunnels designed to test real engineering problems: how air flows over structures, how it pushes against objects in flight, how to predict and tame the invisible currents that shape our world. Eiffel was not alone in dreaming of conquering the skies. The early 20th century was an age of aviation pioneers: the Wright brothers in America, Alberto Santos Dumont drifting his airships over Paris rooftops. But where most early aviators relied on daring guesswork and fragile fabric wings, Eiffel brought the rigor of iron bridges to the science of flight. He tested scale models of airplane wings, propellers, and fuselages inside his wind tunnels, meticulously recording airflow, lift, drag, and turbulence. He published his findings in thick, precise volumes, books that would become essential reading for a new generation of pilots and engineers. He showed how to design shapes that could slip through the air with less resistance. His work laid the groundwork for modern aerodynamics, the same principles that would lift biplanes off the ground, send zeppelins drifting across the skies, and eventually, decades later, hurl rockets into orbit. But Eiffel's curiosity did not end with the wind. The tower itself, standing so impossibly tall above Paris, turned out to be the perfect antenna. While many still saw it as an odd iron attraction for tourists, Eiffel saw it as a giant conduit for invisible forces. He allowed scientists and the French military to install radio equipment at its peak. Soon, the tower was transmitting some of Europe's earliest long-range wireless signals. By 1903, it was sending messages more than 400 kilometers away, a feat that would change how nations communicated, how navies signaled across oceans, how news and voices would someday travel through the air itself. What had started as a symbol of modern spectacle became a backbone of modern science and defense. In his final decades, Eiffel became less a builder of bridges and more a builder of knowledge. He published over 30 major scientific papers, his wind tunnels whirring with new tests well into his old age. He lectured, mentored, and advised young engineers, men and women whose own ideas would push aviation and meteorology into the 20th century. And through it all, he still climbed his tower. It was said that visitors might find him perched on the dizzying observation deck, peering through anemometers and weather instruments, noting wind speeds with the same calm focus he once gave to rivets and beams. The tower that was once called an eyesore, the useless monster of iron, became the city's guardian, its laboratory in the sky, its silent transmitter of signals and dreams. For Eiffel, it was never just about iron. It was about pushing boundaries, building a bridge not just from bank to bank or ground to sky, but from what we know to what we might know if we dare to climb higher. Every builder must one day lay down his tools. Even the master of iron and wind, who lifted Paris into the clouds, could not hold back the tide of time. By the early 20th century, Gustave Eiffel was no longer the brash young engineer clambering across unfinished bridges or battling critics in city halls. He was an old man, but not idle. His mind still sharp, his notebooks still filling with figures, sketches, and questions about the invisible forces that shape our world. He watched as the tower he fought so hard to build took on a life of its own. Parisians, once furious at its looming skeleton, now flocked to its platforms, bringing lovers and tourists from every corner of the globe. He watched as his wind tunnels and meticulous data shaped the wings of the first true airplanes, machines he could only have dreamed of in his youth. He saw wireless telegraphs, weather balloons, and radio towers blossom from seeds he'd planted in the clouds above Paris. In these later years, Gustave Eiffel did not crave the limelight. He withdrew to his home on Rue Rabelais, a comfortable Parisian townhouse where he surrounded himself with family, friends, and the steady hum of his work. He welcomed scientists, engineers, students, any mind that thirsted for knowledge, and shared his belief that iron and equations could change the world. On December 27, 1923, Gustave Eiffel died quietly in his home at the age of 91, an age few reached in those days. It was not iron or scandal that claimed him, but simply the gentle final breath of a man who had spent a lifetime defying gravity and convention. His funeral was not grand, but the grief was genuine. Engineers, workers, architects, and ordinary Parisians lined the streets. Many remembered him not only as the father of the tower, but as the man who gave them work, who built structures that did not fail, who pushed France into the modern age, one rivet, one beam, one gust of wind at a time. A legacy riveted into the sky. Today, his name is forever fused with that lattice crown above the Champ de Mars. But Gustave Eiffel's legacy is larger than a single tower, no matter how tall. He left behind more than iron frameworks. He left a blueprint for ambition itself. Every modern skyscraper that uses a skeletal steel frame echoes Eiffel's daring approach. Build up, not just out. Every wind tunnel, every test of an airplane's wing or a bridge's span owes a debt to the principles he refined in his towers and laboratories. The Statue of Liberty still lifts her torch high, balanced by the invisible ribs Eiffel designed to keep her steady through storms and centuries. The Garabit Viaduct, the Porto Bridge, the railway lines that carry passengers across gorges and valleys, all still stand today, elegant testaments that iron, when shaped by a master, can last far beyond a single lifetime. And there is the tower itself, once mocked as an eyesore, now one of the most beloved symbols on Earth. Each year, millions look up at its graceful iron lace and feel something stir in their chests, proof that a single vision, stubbornly defended against mockery and doubt, can become an icon. In the end, Gustave Eiffel's greatest triumph was not merely to build things that stand, but to show us that even cold iron can lift the human spirit if shaped with courage and care. He did not set out to be a symbol, a legend, or a monument. He set out to solve problems, to span rivers, tame winds, lift ideas from paper to sky. In doing so, he showed generations of dreamers that there is no such thing as too high. Only a question: how will you get there? Gustave Eiffel, a man who raised Paris and all of us just a little closer to the stars. Why does Eiffel matter today? Gustave Eiffel died a century ago, and yet, if you stand in any city that dares to build upward, you stand in his shadow. The iron has changed, the rivets replaced by welded steel and glass. Our towers now scrape skies thousands of feet higher than Eiffel's spire ever reached. But each one carries a piece of his spirit, the idea that humans are meant to reach above the ordinary. Eiffel matters today because he proved that engineering is not only numbers and girders, it's imagination given shape. He showed that science and art, when fused by vision, can transform how we live, how we dream, and how we see ourselves on this fragile earth. A symbol that transcended mockery. Think of his tower, once hated, now beloved. Millions come to Paris not only for the cathedrals and cafes, but to stand beneath that great iron lattice, craning their necks to the sky. It is a paradox, cold metal yet warm with romance, a massive industrial skeleton that somehow feels weightless and alive. The Eiffel Tower taught generations that beauty can be born of function, that the bones of industry, bolts, trusses, steel, can inspire the heart as much as marble columns or painted frescoes. When we see modern landmarks like the London Eye, the Tokyo Skytree, or the soaring steel giants of Dubai and Shanghai, we see echoes of Eiffel's faith that structure itself can be poetry. But Eiffel's legacy is not just in towers that kiss the clouds. It's in every bridge that leaps across a gorge with elegance rather than brute weight. It's in the quiet genius of wind tunnels and aerodynamic design that make our cars slip through the air with less drag, that help rockets split the sky on their way to orbit. Every jet that lifts from a runway carries calculations rooted in Eiffel's experiments high above Paris. His wind tunnels taught generations how to read the invisible push and pull of air, lessons that shaped aviation, shaped weather forecasting, shaped the very science that lets us fly. A warning and a promise. Eiffel also matters because his life reminds us that vision comes with risk, and sometimes betrayal. His fall during the Panama scandal was a lesson carved in headlines. Even the purest engineering genius can be brought low by greed and politics. But his choice to stand firm, to rebuild his name through science, is the greater lesson. He showed that true builders do not quit when the critics circle. They do not crumble when fortune flees. They climb again, step by iron step, even when the wind cuts their face at 300 meters above the streets. In an age of glass and steel, today, as we build higher, faster, and lighter, as we cover our cities with towers of shimmering glass and carbon fiber beams, Eiffel's spirit whispers through every crane and blueprint. Ask how it stands, yes, but also ask what it says about you. Does your tower serve only the ego, or does it lift a city's dreams? Does your bridge simply cross the water, or does it connect people, spark trade, make life larger than it was before? Eiffel matters because he reminds us that engineering is not just construction, it's connection. Between banks of a river, between earth and sky, between vision and reality. So next time you stand in the tower's shadow, or any tower's shadow, tilt your head back and feel that ache in your neck. Remember that it began with a man who saw a sketch on a scrap of paper and dared to say, "Yes, let's build it." And in that iron lattice, in that gust of wind that whistles through its beams, in every steel bridge that leaps a gorge, you'll find the true shape of Gustave Eiffel, a builder who proved that even iron can fly, if only you believe it should. So, my friends, tonight we have walked across the iron beams of bridges that stitched together distant shores. We have climbed a tower once called an abomination, now embraced as a crown upon the city of light. We have stood beside a man who rose from the vineyards of Dijon to the windswept decks of the Eiffel Tower, scribbling notes as the world spun far below his boots. Gustave Eiffel was no king, no conqueror of armies, yet he conquered distances, spanned chasms, dared the wind to push against his dreams. He built not with gold or marble, but with iron, cold to the touch, yet alive in the right hands. When others mocked him, he measured. When they doubted him, he calculated. When scandal nearly buried him, he did not roar back in anger. He rose above it, higher than stone cathedrals, higher than the storms that lash the Parisian sky. His bridges still stand, over the Garonne, the Douro, the deep gorges of Garabit, proof that practical things can also be beautiful. His tower still stands, proof that a symbol born of steel can make people fall in love, year after year, generation after generation. And his spirit, it stands too. In every modern engineer sketching blueprints late into the night, in every student who looks at the wind and wonders how to master it, in every city skyline that reaches skyward not just for profit, but for the sheer audacity of saying, look what we can do. So tonight, if you wish, raise your glass to Gustave Eiffel, the quiet man who taught us that iron can lift not just trains and towers, but the human spirit itself. Thank you for wandering through history with me tonight, my friends. May your bridges be strong, your towers be true, and your dreams always stand a little taller than the skeptics say they should. I am, as ever, your host, the Duke of New York, and this has been Faces of History. Until next time, keep looking up. Good night.